Okay, you guys, welcome back to another episode of Freedom Papers. I don't know about you, I'm a little biased, but I think this is quite the show. I'm a history nerd, and I love that all of our listeners, you guys seem like history nerds too. Now, here's the thing. I'm a history nerd, and I also admit the fact that I am a grandmother. I never go out. I went out maybe like 3 times in high school, 3 times in college. All of them sucked. And now I'm 24, and I still don't. But Morgan loves country music. Morgan loves conservative speakers, and I found out from Turning Point, which, again, a little biased, but I love them because they power this podcast. I found out they're having this country music concert and conservative speaker event called America Fest at the end of December. I think it's December 18th through 21 in December, and I found out on top of that if you use code Morgan, I have my own code, you get 25% off on your ticket. So go to tpusa.com/AmericaFest. Use the code Morgan for 25% off. And I kid you not, they're going to do more announcements, but we've already got people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and then singers like Brantley Gilbert who are going to come, and it's going to be like the winning of the culture wars, baby. So I'm all about it. I love country music. I'm more old school, but it's okay. I'll listen to these new people at this America Fest. Okay, I'm really excited. And again, I never go out to this kind of stuff, but I am pumped for America Fest. So I hope you'll be there with me. It's in Phoenix, Arizona. So I hope you're there. Go to tpusa.com/AmericaFest and use code Morgan for 25% off. When they said that to me, I was like, oh, look at me being a little influencer or something. Just kidding. I totally am not. But hey, you get a code and you get to save a little money, and I'm conservative, so I love being smart with the funds, if you know what I mean. Now, moving on into what this episode is about, I really love this episode, you guys. We are going to finish up papers 2 through 5 in the Federalist Papers that were called Concerning Dangers from Foreign Force and Influence. I've told you a little bit about this through papers 2 through 4, but I want to do a quick recap first to start off, and then we'll get into our other discussion points. Now, you guys, the other discussion points after we finish this recap, we're going to talk about a case study from Publius. He basically looks at the situation where Scotland joined into Great Britain and how that's similar to when all of our little states and confederacies formed together to join the Union of America, and making that same case for why we're stronger together, the way Queen Anne did back in like 1706. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so then he says there's a lot of lessons for us to learn from Europe, because look at all the fighting they've done. Let's avoid that. All those little countries, they had different interests and different aspects to their economies and their goals as countries, and they ended up some being a little more powerful than the others and then oppressing each other, because that's the nature of mankind. So how can we avoid that? How can we learn from history? And then what I really want to do is just look, there's a really great back and forth between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists in this debate. And you're going to see, it's going to challenge you a little bit, because I definitely usually align more with the Federalists, I'll be honest. But I totally see where the Anti-Federalist paper is coming on this. I see both sides. And this is one of the reasons why I really like number 5 and this general topic, because it shows a really great back and forth in the debate. And you see how both sides made great points, and how kind of like a meeting of the minds in this situation led to the final solution that we have here in America today. So that being said, let's do a quick recap on papers 2 through 5. So just to give everybody a quick refresher, the Federalist Papers, 85 papers. The first half is why we need to come together, basically making the case for why we're smarter and stronger together as a union than we would be if we were individual separated states or confederacies. The second half of these 85 papers, and it's not exactly half, but the second portion of these papers basically explains the Constitution and what our structure of government would look like if the United States people of the time in 1787 voted to ratify. So what would that look like for our country? And that's more about structure. So just to give you guys a heads up, when we bring on guests, I'm going to try and pull papers from the second part, the structure of our government, so that we can all hear from the people inside the government in the inner workings to see, so did it end up looking like this the way our founders intended, or what's going on behind the scenes? And then when it's just me, we're going to do more of the history nerd kind of stuff and break down the Union, because that's where it really gets a little more technical, and we could talk about the fun historic tidbits that our founders included to make the case for why we're stronger together. But papers 2 through 5 were the only papers written by John Jay. So another recap. We've got Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They all wrote a bunch of the essays, but John Jay only wrote papers 2 through 5. Paper 2 was called Concerning Dangers from Foreign Force and Influence, and if you guys remember, it's one of my favorite Federalist papers. It's the one that was just so beautiful. It made these really emotional pleas for why America should be together, and he basically says, we were brought together, the land of America, the fertile soil, the navigable waters, everything about America is so blessed in many ways. We are so lucky, and we're giving so much opportunity here by being on this specific land. It was almost as if this land and this people, these freedom-seeking people that had liberty in their forefront of their mind, were brought together by providence. That's what Publius says in number 2. By providence. That's kind of fascinating, and it's one of my favorite quotes. I believe I said that I was going to get it tattooed on my body, but I'm not going to do that because I'm not a fan of tattoos on myself. Instead, I'll get it on a quote on a wall or something, or I'll put it in like the Turning Point studio. I'll hang it in a frame there. But that's number 2. So he makes the more emotional plea for when we have to deal with foreign affairs, why would we split now after we just won a revolutionary war? And out of all of the places in the world, our people were brought together on this land. It's just fascinating to me. Number 3, though, makes a more technical case, and it basically goes into why safety is really one of the most important things when you're forming any society, especially a free society. He says, yeah, there's domestic issues that we're going to have to handle, and we'll get into that later, but what about the hostilities that are going to no doubt come from abroad? He says conflict is frequent thanks to the nature of mankind. So how can we limit that amount of conflict? And he basically, Publius says, well, when you have a bunch of little states, you're going to have a bunch of little tiny governments that are doing their own foreign affairs, and that's going to just lead to naturally more conflicts. But what if we all combined and did our bidding as a one strong union on the international world stage? We would be stronger at the negotiating table, we would be stronger together, and we would be less likely to get in little quarrels because there aren't as many people arguing at the table, basically. So that was number 3. Then number 4 gets into more of so number 3 is like the just reasons of war, right? Countries are going to go to war together or with each other. But number 4 makes the case for what about the more weird reasons why countries have fought, like trade or economic competition. He says our relations with other countries, as we succeed as a country and as we grow, as our economy gets stronger here on this land, because we do have these navigable waters, we do have this fertile soil, we're not only no longer buying products from other countries that we used to rely on, we are now becoming their competition, and that's going to lead to some sketchy situations for us down the road. And so then he makes the case that we are not only stronger together for serious issues when there are situations of potential war, but when it comes to just getting at the bargaining table, when it comes to dealing with trade, when it comes to potential animosities that can build up from other things, we are stronger in the global economy and at the negotiating table when we are one union. Number 5, though, this is a whole new topic, but still relating to why we are stronger together on the international stage. And now we're going to get into that. Just a quick reminder, though, you guys, John Jay, I'm going to say his bio one last time. I say it every single time, but it's because it's that important for us to understand and have it ingrained in our minds. History Channel says John Jay served as the key negotiator at the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolutionary War and recognized the independence of the United States. He later served as the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and the second governor of New York State. So, again, you guys, this guy is a pretty big deal. I mean, the key negotiator at the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. Obviously, this guy knows what he's talking about, and I really appreciate what he says here. So, first discussion point, this is what I want to get into first, and this is what Publius gets right into. He references a letter from Queen Anne from England in her attempt to get people to support the idea of Scotland joining in to Great Britain. Now, I'm a huge history nerd, and so I also don't watch a lot of TV, but what I do love to watch, if I'm going to watch something, it is going to be like a historical fiction show or a historical documentary, whatever. And I love learning about the Tudors. I love learning about Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth. And all of it really comes together. This was what really blew my mind. All of it comes together when you start connecting the dots between the Tudor dynasty and Elizabeth, the first in England, Queen Elizabeth, and Mary, Queen of Scots, who gets her head chopped off by Queen Elizabeth because she's the Queen of Scots, and then Elizabeth is the Queen of England, and they are fighting with each other because they both want to take over each other. Well, what happens is both of those women die. One gets killed by the other. But then James is the son of Mary, and he has to run Scotland and bring everybody together. He becomes not only the King of Scotland, but he's also the King of England in that way. So the merging of these families and of these different countries starts to come together after these two women die. And then you have Scotland and England, and they both had different systems of government, but technically one king. It's hard to understand, and you're going to have to look into this yourself to really see the big picture. But what Publius does is he says, look at these two separate but small entities. They used to fight for so long, and then they decided to form together. We should take that same mindset, and it would prevent us from having conflict with each other, and it would make us stronger together on the international stage. So Publius starts by referencing the letter from Queen Anne, and I think it's really important to look at this because we're referencing our founders, and then our founders were referencing even more previous people in history, and I think that's so interesting. We always talk about learn from history to not repeat it. Well, paper number 5 is literally our founders saying we must learn from history to not repeat it. And here we are again, hundreds of years later, saying the same thing. So it's important for us to understand where their mindset was. And hey, maybe in a few hundred years, someone will be like, hey, this one time, Morgan Zegers said that we need to learn from history, so now we need to learn from her. That's totally not going to happen, but hey, a girl can dream. So, number 5, a same subject continued. Publius says, Queen Anne, in her letter of the 1st July 1706 to the Scotch Parliament, makes some observations in the importance of the union then forming between England and Scotland, which merit our attention. I shall present to the public with 1 or 2 extracts from it. Quote, an entire and perfect union will be the solid foundation of lasting peace. It will secure your religion, liberty, and property, remove the animosities amongst yourselves and the jealousies and differences betwixt our 2 kingdoms. It must increase your strength, riches, and trade, and by this union the whole island, being joined in affection and free from all apprehensions of other different interests, will be enabled to resist all its enemies. So not only is she saying we're going to benefit by being together, but we're also going to be stronger when it comes to dealing with our enemies if we are together. Then Queen Anne says, quote, we most earnestly recommend to you calmness and unanimity in this great and weighty affair, that the union may be brought to a happy conclusion, being the only effectual way to secure our present and future happiness, and disappoint the designs of our and your enemies, who will doubtless on this occasion use their utmost endeavors to prevent or delay this union. End quote. So that was Queen Anne making the case for why Scotland and England should join together. And I mean, guys, the language that she's using is so similar to the language of the Federalist Papers. It's fascinating for me to read. So that's what we have first, referencing Queen Anne's letter. And here's the thing, and this is where the Anti-Federalists come in. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but it seems a little happy-go-lucky, you know what I'm saying? Like all, the grass is always greener on the other side, if you will, and look how good it is over there. But we'll find out. It wasn't perfect when they joined, and that's what our Anti-Federalists were worried about. So moving on, though, then it gets into Publius talking about the concerns that he has with the history of Europe and how, yes, there were problems, and yes, it wasn't perfect, but that's good for us because we can now analyze it and make sure we don't repeat their problems. So how can we take the lessons and go? Here's what he says. Publius says, it was remarked in the preceding paper that weakness and divisions at home would invite dangers from abroad, and that nothing would tend more to secure us from them than union, strength, and good government within ourselves. This subject is copious and cannot easily be exhausted. The history of Great Britain is the one with which we are in general the best acquainted, and it gives us many useful lessons. We may profit by their experience without paying the price which it cost them. Although it seems obvious to common sense that the people of such islands should be but one nation, yet we find that they were for ages divided into 3, and that those 3 were almost constantly embroiled in quarrels and wars with one another. Notwithstanding their true interest with respect to the continental nations was really the same, yet by the arts and policy and practices of those nations their mutual jealousies were perpetually kept inflamed, and for a long series of years they were far more inconvenient and troublesome than they were useful and assisting to each other. And so when they were small and disunited, the 3 entities that make up the island of Great Britain now they were always fighting. And what he references is a difference in culture, a difference in lifestyle, a difference in how government was viewed and what the role of government should be in people's lives, even as simple as what the arts are and what people did in their free time. It leads to differences between countries and populations. And that leads to animosities, similar to what we talked about with Federalist Paper number 10, the creation of factions. Now, he goes on to say, should the people of America divide themselves into 3 or 4 nations, would not that same thing happen? Would not similar jealousies arise and be in like manner cherished? Instead of their being joined in affection and free from all apprehension of different interests, envy and jealousy would soon extinguish confidence and affection, and the partial interests of each confederacy, instead of the general interests of all America, would be the only objects of their policy and pursuits. Hence, like most other bordering nations, they would always be either involved in disputes and war or live in the constant apprehension of them. And that's what we saw in England. So I think that's very interesting. Now, this is where we have to start comparing what ended up happening in America, what's happening modern day, and what we saw back in England. It's when you have differing countries that are no longer formed together or encouraged to cooperate, you're going to have animosity and you're going to have some countries rise up. And that's really one of the big topics of this paper is this is going to lead, different styles of living, different styles of government will lead to different levels of success and power in a country. And this is where Publius gets into it. He says, whenever and from whatever causes it may happen or happen it would, that any one of these nations or confederacies should rise on the scale of political importance much above the degree of her neighbors, that moment would those neighbors behold her with envy and with fear. Both those passions would lead them to countenance, if not to promote, whatever might promise to diminish her importance, and would also restrain them from measures calculated to advance or even to secure her prosperity. Much time would not be necessary to enable her to discern these unfriendly dispositions. She would soon begin not only to lose confidence in her neighbors, but also to feel a disposition equally unfavorable to them. Distrust naturally creates distrust, and by nothing is goodwill and kind conduct more speedily changed than by the invidious jealousies and uncandid imputations, whether expressed or implied. I love that quote, distrust naturally creates distrust. We can think about that on a country by country, country versus country level, but also think of it like in a relationship. As soon as you start acting that way, distrust continues to create distrust, and that leads to the end. It's like when people say once you start sleeping on the couch, that marriage is probably over. You cannot set that standard, or at least that's what I read online. I have no idea. I can't give relationship advice. But basically, Publius is saying here, if we have 3 to 4 confederacies and we look like the island where there's Scotland and England and the rest of them, we will end up with different styles of government. I mean, imagine you guys, if we had like now in America, the Southwest, the Northwest, the Northeast, and the Southeast, and then maybe one in Middle America too, because we've got the flyover states there. Those styles of living, those styles of what people in those areas desire for their representation in government is so wildly different, okay? And so if we saw them as regions that became their own small governments, I do not think that that would work out very well, okay? I think, as history has shown, when you have that differing sense of lifestyle and views on the world, you're going to have animosity that leads to conflict. Our founders were saying we are going to have constant infighting in the property, the actual land that is currently the United States of America. If we allow this to happen on our own soil, we have to stay united for our sake and for the sake of the people so that they don't get attacked. And we have to secure the safety in that way. Okay, so then what I think is interesting is Publius tries to guess what would happen and make the case for what would happen if we did split into regional confederacies or little countries. And he says that it would probably be the North. He says, quote, "The North is generally the region of strength, and many local circumstances render it probably that the most northern of the proposed confederacies would, at a period not very distant, be unquestionably more formidable than any others." So he proposes that the North, if mated to a confederacy, would become more powerful than the other confederacies in the nation, or in America, and it people would start to encroach on other areas. And he basically says, like, once they've reached a certain level of success, I mean, people aren't really satisfied when they are limited. They're going to start saying, hey, that land over there in the other country looks a little good, or their resources look a little good. Maybe we should add them into our situation. And that's how you get to a conflict. And by that, I mean a war, people. Here's the next thing. Moving on to the idea of what the Anti-Federalists were saying. Anti-Federalists were making the case that if we remained separated and not a strong federal government, if we didn't form a union, we would be in a better situation because the people would have more decentralized power. But not only that, we would have allies in each other. And so they made the case that all the different entities would be able to support each other, provide resources, share resources, and really be friendly neighbors, if you will. And the Federalists hit back at that and they say, absolutely not. Have you not seen all of history? Countries that are small and are right next to each other, as we see in England, are in no way incentivized to say, hey, let's be neighbors and never fight. Let's support each other as we handle these international conflicts. Let's always be allies. Let's always join in and be friendly neighbors. Instead, what you got is, instead of looking at the country next to you as a neighbor country, loving thy neighbor, they see it as, oh, that's a border state, and that is a potential conflict for us, and we probably have animosity with those people over there on the other side of the border. They are not our neighbors. And it's not that they're being cruel in saying that. It's just that they're like, look at history. It never shows that these small entities will ever be happy allies forever. So what Publius says after that is he says, they who well consider the history of similar divisions and confederacies will find abundant reason to apprehend that those in contemplation would in no other sense be neighbors than as they would be just borderers. So instead of seeing our fellow Americans as neighbors, we would see them as borderers or people of other areas that aren't us, and we have to protect our own. Then he says that they would neither love nor trust one another, but on the contrary would be prey to discord, jealousy, and mutual injuries. In short, that they would place us exactly in the situations in which some nations doubtless wish to see us, formidable only to each other. Oh, I loved that. Formidable only to each other. What does that mean? I looked up the definition of formidable. I feel like words get twisted so much these days, or overused or misused, so I like to look up the definitions just to get that refresher. The definition of formidable is inspiring fear or respect through being impressively large, powerful, intense, or capable. And so what he's saying is our enemies abroad, like in England and everywhere else in the rest of the world, they want us to be disunited. They want us to be constantly fighting on this soil because then they can prey on us. They only want us to be threatening to each other, because when we're constantly being threatening to each other and only infighting, then it's a lot easier for them to attack us, or them to just be like, they're no longer competition, we don't have to worry. But if we're united, we are strong at the world stage. And Publius is making that case. So now we're going to get into a little give and take, okay? A little give and take from the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I want you guys to hear the back and forth between what was going on between these guys. So the Federalists, here's a quote from Publius. He says, "It appears that those persons are greatly mistaken who suppose that alliances, offensive and defensive, might be formed between these confederacies, and would produce that combination and union of wills, of arms, of resources, which would be necessary to put and keep them in a formidable state of defense against foreign enemies." So the Federalists are saying, the Anti-Federalists claim that we would be strong even if we weren't united in a union, because we would be able to be allies to each other and we'd share resources. And that's a little naive, I think, to put it kindly. Publius says, basically, we'd be like divided and it would be so much easier to be conquered. So the classic term, divide and conquer. And you would think that we would be strong and form allies and, or form alliances between our confederacies, but why would we do that if that's exactly what our enemies would want in the first place? That it clearly shows that that is a position of weakness that we would be taking. Now, the Anti-Federalists, they start replying, and they really start debunking the concept that it's even a good idea to look at what's going on in England as a reference to begin with. And this is what they say. It must be obvious to everyone, the least acquainted with English history, that since the union of the two nations, the great body of the people in Scotland are in a much worse situation now than they would be were they a separate union. This would be fully illustrated by attending to the great emigrations which are made to America. For if the people could have but a common support at home, it is unreasonable to suppose that such large numbers would quit their country, break from the tender ties of kindred and friendship, and trust themselves on a dangerous voyage across a vast ocean to a country of which they can know but very little except by common report. So that's a pretty good argument to make is, okay, so why are the Federalists even referencing the joining of Scotland and England? Because haven't you seen how many immigrants from Scotland have been coming to our country since they joined? If they don't like the fact that their country is now joined in this union so much that they're willing to go across a massive ocean in the 1700s, this is not like a quick little red-eye flight over to Europe, then why would we say, let's try it here too? So I think that's fascinating and pretty funny. So basically he's saying it's foolish to even use the example of Queen Anne's plea and then the eventual joining of Scotland and England on the island of Great Britain. So the Federalists hit back. And they say, when did the independent states into which Britain and Spain were formally divided combine in such alliance or unite their forces against a foreign enemy? The proposed confederacies will be distinct nations. Each of them would have its commerce with foreigners to regulate by distinct treaties, and as their production and commodities are different and proper for different markets, so would those treaties be essentially different. Different commercial concerns must create different interests, and of course, different degrees of political attachment to and connection with different foreign nations. So I just want to pause right there. What he's saying is, okay, well, then you Anti-Federalists, why are you looking at history and then saying, well, I think it's going to be really smart for us to stay separated because we'll be able to be allies and be stronger together? Because if you look at history as well, when was the last time Britain and Spain, who are right next to each other as well, just like we would be if we were little confederacies, when was the last time they helped each other? And he goes on to say, not only that, but our differences as little confederacies, our differences in trade and the things that we produce and the type of economy that we have, that might lead to us having different international interests if we are no longer united. We won't have the same interests. We won't have that desire to cooperate. And so what if, the Northeast and the Southeast say, wait, we want to ally with different people, different countries, and that might not make the Southeast and the Northeast even want to be allies because it might be a conflict of interest that's no longer in their best interest with their goals in mind. So he goes on to say, hence it might and probably would happen that the foreign nation with whom the Southern Confederacy might be at war with would be the one with whom the Northern Confederacy would be the most desirous of preserving peace and friendship. An alliance so contrary to their immediate interest would not therefore be easy to form, nor if formed would it be observed and fulfilled with perfect good faith. And so he's saying not only would we not be allies probably, but we would probably ally with people that might be other confederacies' enemies. And that might get a little sticky. So then the Anti-Federalists come back, and they have their own answer, and they say, it is a certainty that when the Union was subject of debate in the Scottish legislature, some of their most sensible and disinterested nobles, as well as commoners, ! Who were not corrupted by English gold, violently opposed the Union and predicted that the people of Scotland would in fact derive no advantages from a consolidation of government with England, but on the contrary, they would bear a great proportion of her debt and furnish large bodies of men to assist in her wars with France, with whom, before the Union, Scotland was at all times on terms of the most cordial amity. And so what the Anti-Federalists are saying is, listen, the Scots were actually really worried about joining in to Great Britain, joining with England, because first of all, England doesn't get along with France, but Scotland did, and they would lose an ally that they had always gotten along with. And they were worried, listen, so now we're going to have to pay taxes to this larger form of government where our tax money is probably not going to go to serving us. There's no way of determining if that would be the case or not. Why are we just going to trust that this larger government is going to support us and be there for us? Now we have to give you our military and our young men who can serve, and we're going to have to give you their lives and our resources, our military strength, for you to go fight your own wars against what? Our old allies, France? So a whole bunch of problems there. It wasn't as golden as the Federalists painted it by just prettily referencing Queen Anne's letter in the beginning of Federalist Paper number 5. Then the Anti-Federalists go on to say, so if you're telling us, Mr. Federalist peoples, if you're telling us that the Union would bring greater security and we'd be able to pool our resources together if we were all under one centralized government, then how come that didn't exactly happen with Scotland and you're still referencing Scotland? They go on and they say, this is Anti-Federalists, they say, it deserves to also be remembered that the people of Scotland, in the late war between France and Great Britain, petitioned to have arms and ammunition supplied them by their general government for their defense, alleging that they were incapable of defending themselves and their property from an invasion unless they were assisted by the government. It is a truth that their petitions were disregarded, and reasons were assigned that it would be dangerous to entrust them with the means of defense, as they would then have it in their power to break the Union. That's not good. That reminds me of a good old Second Amendment argument that we have here in America, that we need the ability to be able to protect ourselves. Why would England tell the people of Scotland that they don't even deserve to have access to resources? Because it might allow them to remove themselves from the country. It's very interesting. So then he says, from this representation of the situation of Scotland, surely no one can draw any conclusion that this country would derive happiness or security from a government which would, in reality, give the people but the mere name of being free. And so basically, Federalists, you can say that we're going to be stronger together. You can say we're going to get resources, but is it naive for us to trust a big government? I mean, at Turning Point USA, we are anti-big government, right? The Anti-Federalists are like, why would we trust big government to say that they will send us resources if we need them, to say they'll protect us and provide security against enemies if we get invaded or attacked, when in reality we saw that situation play out in Scotland, we saw those promises be made, and then we saw Great Britain deny resources and support and safety and protection to the people of Scotland because they were worried that Scotland would rise up and they didn't want them to have access to protective resources. Things got spicy, okay? So now let's look at the closing arguments for Anti-Federalists and Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, they say, I observe that the writer above mentioned takes great pains to show the disadvantages which would result from the 3 or 4 distinct confederacies of these states. I must confess that I have not seen in any of the pieces published against the proposed Constitution anything which gives the most distant idea that their writers are in favor of such governments. What is he saying, you guys? So the writer of the Anti-Federalist paper in this argument, when this Anti-Federalist and Federalist debate is basically saying, like, are we stronger or would it be better for us to remain as separate 3 or 4 confederacies? The writer of the Anti-Federalist paper, he says, why are we even talking about this right now? No one on our side, or basically no one legitimate on our side, is even making the case for having 3 or 4 confederacies. Why are you making up a fake argument for us to argue about when no one in any of the Anti-Federalist papers so far have even said that that's what we want as the solution? And what he's accusing Publius of, the Federalist writer, he's saying, you are making a false argument to manipulate the people of America into supporting your idea for a union. We got some politicking going on here. So he goes on to say, but it is clear these objections arise from a consolidation not affording security for the liberties of the country, and from hence it must evidently appear that the design of Publius, in artfully holding up to public view the bugbear of such confederacies, can be with no other intention than willfully to deceive his fellow citizens. I am confident it must be, and that it is, the most sincere wish of every true friend to the United States that there should be a confederated national government, but that it should be one which would have a control over national and external matters only, and not interfere with the internal regulations and police of the different states of the Union. Such a government, while it would give us respectability abroad, would not encroach upon or subvert our liberties at home. And so we're going to get into all those topics. I mean, like, we're only on paper 5 people. So this is just paper number 5. The Anti-Federalists are saying, you're not even arguing in an honest way at this point. And this is what we really want. They do want some sort of formation at a national, more federal level that would encourage cooperation between the states. They're just saying they don't want a huge, powerful, centralized government. So I think that's really interesting, and that's a good place for us to understand where we're going from now on, now that we are moving out of the small section of paper 2 to 5. But basically, what they're doing here, the Anti-Federalists are accusing Jay of being dishonest and intentionally misleading the readers into thinking that the Anti-Federalists are advocating for the creation of a 3 to 4 individual countries or confederacies with no with no group coordination, and that we would end up being like the fighting countries of Europe. Anti-Federalists are saying that's not what we're advocating for at all, you liars. So now let's look at what the Federalists say as they wrap up their essay. So Publius signs off and he says, "Nay, it is far more probable that in America, as in Europe, neighboring nations, acting under the impulse of opposite interests and unfriendly passions, would be frequently found taking different sides. Considering our distance from Europe, it would be more natural for these confederacies to apprehend danger from one another than from distant nations, and therefore that each of them should be more desirous to guard against the others by the aid of foreign alliances than to guard against foreign dangers by alliances between themselves." I think that's really smart. What he's saying is that not only are we going to end up arguing and fighting if we were in these small, disunited confederacies, but when we start fighting, we're going to need support. And we're going to go to other countries for support. And this is where things get sticky, and we can kind of see it play out in modern day. What countries are going to help us? Countries that are stronger than us and that want to be able to say, hey, we helped you, now you have to help us. Countries that are going to be able to say, now you're kind of reliant on us, and we're going to abuse this power, and we're going to use it against you because we have our own interests. So Publius goes to say, and here let us not forget how much more easy it is to receive foreign fleets into our ports and foreign armies into our country than it is to persuade or compel them to depart. And I mean, they just tried this 10 years ago to get England to leave. Look how hard that was. They had to fight a revolutionary war. So it's a lot easier for countries to be like, hey, we need some help. Can you come help? And they're like, yeah, totally. Like, let us come help you. Sure, we're never going to leave, and we're going to turn you into a colony and take all of your money. That's the concern there. So he says, how many conquests did the Romans and others make in the characters of allies, and what innovations did they, under the same character, introduce into the governments of those whom they pretended to protect? Quote, pretended to protect. That's what would happen if we were fighting on American soil between each other and we had foreign allies start to come in and help us fight each other. They are going to pretend to help and protect us, but now we are inviting them onto our land. He finishes and he says, let candid men judge then whether the division of America into any given number of independent sovereignties would tend to secure us against the hostilities and improper interference of foreign nations. Publius. Now, again, the Anti-Federalist finish really kind of debunks this and says, listen, we're not even advocating for 3 to 4 confederacies, but sure, make your case, whatever. I think it's interesting for me, though. I still, even though they weren't necessarily advocating for this, and it's a strange debate to be having when that's not what the other side is even trying to achieve. But it's still good for us to acknowledge, why didn't we join into 3 to 4 confederacies? These were the pros, those were the cons, and I'm certainly glad that we didn't. So now that we've done the whole analysis of the papers, let's evaluate Morgan's thoughts, Morgan's little connections, and what came to my mind as I'm reading both the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist paper on this idea of 3 to 4 confederacies and comparing us to the history of Europe. Now, first of all, I have this theory that for some reason, Americans, we're so detached and unaware of history that we feel like 1980 was just so long ago, and we feel like the 1950s were so long ago. The Cold War, I mean, I was born in 1996 after the USSR fell. Dang. But we look at history, and even though Nazi Germany, for example, happened less than 100 years ago, we for some reason think that it's just this like ancient history that happened way back then. And part of me wonders, like, is that because everything wasn't in color at the time? Is that because technology has shifted so much that this feels like modern day, and then everything back then, especially in the black and white, old-timey camera stuff, it just was old stuff and it's old history and it doesn't really count, and it wasn't that long, or it wasn't, super recent. But it was recent, okay? 1941, very recent. Very, very recent. 1700s, I'm going to make the case, also very recent. If you read the Bible, I read the Bible sometimes and I'm like, wait, so Jesus and Caesar were all walking around the same times? That's fascinating to me. But it's also like, wow, human history is actually quite short. Time flies. And a century ago, 2 centuries ago, 300 centuries ago, or 3 centuries ago, God, sorry, I'm going crazy, you guys. It was not that long ago. Last night I was reading a book on the history of Korea, and I kid you not, it skips 60 years at a time. 60 years at a time, and it'll just be like, well, and then this dynasty rose up, and then the Mongols came, and Genghis Khan came, and it ended that. And then they were in power for about 100 years or so. And then the new dynasty came in, and they formed this alliance. And then 100 years later, that dynasty fell. That is human history. Just constant wars, constant fighting. And if you look at the history of America, if we were able to keep this union going for we're at almost 300 years now, it's a pretty big deal. And 1706, like we had with Queen Anne, and 1787, where we were debating on ratifying the U.S. Constitution, those were not very long ago. And that's what we have to think. And I can't get my mind wrapped around the concept that our founders literally were sitting down saying, we've got to learn from history to make sure we don't repeat it. Because now, especially with the situation of socialism and communism, which didn't exist at the time when our founders were around, we look at the 20th century and all of us are saying we need to learn from history to not repeat it. But our founders were saying the same thing, and our founders looked at history to make sure we didn't repeat those problems. So our founders were looking at Rome. Publius is Roman. It is looking to Rome. It is looking to Greece. It is looking to the ancient democracies and republics. And they looked at the monarchies. They looked at the dynasties of Europe, and they looked at the dynasties of Asia, and they said, here's the problems that they faced. How can we prevent the wars that they've been going through for decades, hundreds, centuries, whatever. So that's my first thought. Is history is like actually quite a short and shrunken timeline, and things happened a lot more recently than we would like to think. The next thing that I have is that, you guys, the Anti-Federalists were pretty right in accusing the Federalists of being manipulative in their formation of the argument. As it's interesting for me on one end to just hear the case for like, okay, this is why we shouldn't have 3 major confederacies. It's also like, okay, a little concerning that the Federalists were trying to make it seem to the American people like the Anti-Federalists wanted these 3 to 4 confederacies, when in reality that's not the case. They were just advocating for a very, very limited government that would only coordinate really at the national and international level, and then leave the actual domestic issues and the people in America alone. I kind of wish we had that. Our federal government right now is out of control. My third thought. So based on Europe's history up until this point, I think the Federalists were really right in the sense of wanting to avoid the unnecessary conflict of having states or confederacies not join together, because humans have proven, okay, it's simple. At this point, if you don't agree with me, I don't know what you're doing here, but you need to read some history books. History is very clear in the sense that when you have these small entities, they will fight non-stop, especially Europe. So I think the Federalists were right in that sense, and it was smart for them to advocate for us to cooperate instead of fight and have animosity. And then last, my other thought, based on Europe's history as well, though, I think the Anti-Federalists were also right in their concern that the little guy's going to get drowned out. Even if they're paying taxes, even if they were promised security like Scotland was, even if they were promised to be protected from international dangers the way Scotland was promised, because Scotland ended up being let down in many ways and lied to. It's like an abusive relationship again. I always bring this up. It's not good. You got to get yourself out of that situation. But if somebody promises you something, there's no way in determining if they are actually going to provide it when you need it. That's why even in America, like right now, they're defunding the police, and they're telling us that like some 911 calls, apparently you're supposed to answer those within seconds. Some people are waiting like 2 minutes now because our police are defunded, we're short-staffed, and our law enforcement is so weak, as taxpayers, we're paying into the system because we want the basic protections, right? Well, what do we do when we become truly our only self-defense, our only form of defense against a threat? And that's what we saw with the little guy getting drowned out in Europe when Scotland was brought into England. Now, I have some modern connections that I want to talk about, and then we'll wrap it up, okay? First of all, our founders looked at the connections and learned a lot from Europe. And I think we can definitely look in our situation right now, modern day, what can we learn from in history? First of all, the 20th century, the world wars. Look at what happened in Europe there. Oh my gosh, you had all the different countries, even though they were touching, even though they were bordering. Basically, the Anti-Federalists are saying, yeah, they'll be neighbors, they'll support each other. That's not exactly what happened. Instead, what happened is these people started fighting each other, and they didn't treat each other like neighbors. They found international allies, and then they fought each other even though they were touching, even though they were bordering. They saw each other just as bordering nations, not as neighboring allies. So that was kind of proven to be the case. What's I see, though, in another modern twist is we look at Europe a lot. And our founders did, and we can for the 20th century. But I think modern day, if we look at the Middle East, oh my gosh, if we look at like Northern Africa, all of those countries, there's major animosity between the bordering countries in those continents. And have you guys seen what's going on with the world? China, America, the world powers are all basically fighting a Cold War, but in the Middle East. If you think we're in the Middle East just to fight terrorists in sand land, then I'm sorry, you are really missing the big picture here. We are in a Cold War with communist China in Afghanistan, in the Middle East. If you saw, China is paying billions of dollars to the Taliban because they want to mine mineral resources from Afghanistan's land. That is what is going on there. So do you think communist China cares about the Taliban and cares about the women that are oppressed there and cares about the little infighting between Afghanistan and all the rest of the countries in the Middle East? They don't give a crap. They want the mineral resources. They want to succeed in economics. They want to extract what they can out of that weak nation and then get the heck out of there or do whatever they can. Another example. I'm sorry, but this really gets me going. Bagram Air Base is one of the most important locations in this world, on this planet, especially for strategy for world powers, okay? It was a very important location, and I've heard military experts describe losing that airbase as one of the greatest military failures in human history. Happened just a few months ago. One of the greatest military failures in human history. And it's in some place in Afghanistan in the Middle East. Why do world powers care about it? Because we have our own self-interest, and so that puts us in places like the Middle East and Afghanistan. It's not just to fight the terrorists, it is to have our own self-interests served on a national or on an international stage. So that's what we're seeing play out here. To sum up my evaluation and comparing it to what is going on today, the Federalists were very worried that if we were a bunch of disunited states and confederacies in America, we would start infighting, and there would be a lot of conflict, a lot of wars between the small entities. Look at the Middle East now and look at what's happening. The Federalists were worried that if we had these small entities, the other countries of the world that do not care about our little infighting, but do care about exploiting the infighting and taking advantage of the weakened countries and the weakened situations to benefit and get in and get out with whatever they wanted from us and from our land, from our resources. They were worried that that's what would happen, and that's what we see in countries or in areas like the Middle East. And I suggest everybody start looking into the infighting there and the history of the Middle East, the fact that the USSR was involved in that. I mean, the Taliban was formed after the communists from Russia had been in Afghanistan and killed a ton of people, and all of these kids were orphaned because of the communists, and then those orphans ended up becoming the Taliban, and now America's dealing with the Taliban decades later. It's this terrible cycle. So I suggest everybody start to become a little more aware of those connections, the history of it relating to communism in the Middle East, and then now what China's doing and what all the international, world powers are doing in the Middle East, because it's only self-serving. And that's what the Federalists were worried about would happen in America. So thank goodness that we are one united country and we don't have that kind of invasion into our space. To close, though, you guys, Grandma Morgan is tired. I've been talking for an hour. I'm tired. I don't go out, but I will be at America Fest. Okay, so I will be there in Phoenix December 18th through the 21st, right before Christmas. See, I don't know why they do this to me. I am such a Christmas person, and then they do all these super fun, cool events that like aren't Christmas themed right before Christmas, and it totally messes with my mind. So now I have a big country concert, and Tucker Carlson's going to speak right before Christmas. I always ask the HQ people at Turning Point, like, can we make a little like Santa hat thing? Can I wear like a little Christmas costume while we're at these great events that you guys hold right before Christmas? Because I got to be holly jolly, so maybe I'll just wear a Santa hat or something. But I hope to see you guys there. 25% off your ticket to see amazing conservative speakers and huge like international country stars. First one announced that I really love is Brantley Gilbert, and we're going to see a few more announced as well, I'm pretty sure. But use code Morgan for 25% off at tpusa.com/AmericaFest. We're going to get our little country music, country bumpkin on at AmericaFest. I can't wait to see you there. Thank you, Turning Point, for powering this. You guys follow Instagram at Freedom Papers Podcast, and make sure you get your own copy of the books. All right, I'll see you next week. Thanks for listening and getting smart with me.